Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on filling out the Preschool Education Aid Expansion Funding Budget Workbook. My name is Karen Garber. I'm from the National Institute for Early Education Research, and I'm here with my colleague, Beth Gardner. So what we're going to do today is walk you through the basics of filling out the budget and enrollment workbook. Would love to take some questions from you guys at the end. Feel free to type them into the chat box. We have you all muted for now, and we are going to go through each of the different tables in the worksheet, in the workbook, and feel free, like I said, feel free to put your questions in, and we'll try to address those at the end. So the first thing that we wanted to walk you through is Table 1. I know it can be really tempting to start with the budget part of the worksheet, or the workbook rather, but really there are quite a few things in the worksheet of Table 1 that you need to fill out that then carry forward onto other worksheets within the workbook. So you want to make sure that you address Table 1 first before you move on to other parts of the workbook. The very first thing that you'll need to do is select your district name and county name from the drop-down box here. I'm going to go ahead for demonstration purposes and pull up Pennsauken. I don't believe Pennsauken is applying for funding, so we chose them because we didn't want to give any unfair advantages. So I'm going to model out throughout the rest of the presentation, just a scenario, a fairly simple scenario for Pennsauken. So you'll notice that as soon as I select the district and the county name from the drop-down box, right away you'll see that the universe populates here on the worksheet. And this universe represents your first grade ASSA enrollment from last year multiplied by 2. That's this, for Pennsauken, the 636 number, and then it gets separated into a number of estimated 3- and 4-year-olds. This is just your general education preschool eligible estimate of children in the district. So just remember that it's an estimate, but it's something that the department and your application reviewers will be looking at to see that over time you're moving towards trying to serve a greater percentage of your universe. So you're going to want to pay attention to that number, and that'll be significant as you go through the process. The next section here is your 2018-19 actual enrollment. So in here you'll fill out, if you were a district that had a preschool program in the 18-19 school year, you'll go through and show the department what kind of enrollment you had last year. If you did not have a preschool program last year, you can go ahead and leave this blank. Or if you were a district that just had a special education preschool program, you will want to show the department that you had that. In the case of Pennsauken, they had about 149 children that they served in district in general education classrooms, and then they had some children who were children with special needs who were included in those classrooms, as well as some self-contained preschool disabled children. So this actually summarizes the entirety of what this particular district would show to the department they did in the 18-19 school year. If you were contracting with a Head Start or other private provider in 18-19, you can fill that information out in these sections of the worksheet. But if you did not, then you can just simply leave those sections blank. And you'll see that as soon as you enter information into the cells of the worksheet, you'll see totals start to appear and percentages start to appear at the bottom, and that's going to add up your total current enrollment, your general education enrollment, and then look to see roughly what percentage of your general education universe you're currently serving in the program. So moving down to projected enrollment, this is where you're going to show the department and your application reviewers roughly how many children you're looking to serve next year. So with your expanded funding. So for demonstration purposes, I'm going to show that Pennsauken is going to serve about 130 children, general education children, as well as about 20 children, special needs children served in general education classrooms. And then I'm going to show a few classrooms of 3- and 4-year-olds at the Head Start agency, showing inclusion here as well. And again, this is a fairly simple demonstration, so obviously your numbers won't look quite so similar from site to site. This is just for demonstration purposes. So one of the things to note here, you may have noticed that in the example up at the top, this district had been serving about 149 children in 1819, and now that number is actually decreasing for 1920. That may happen to you as well, especially if you're a district that is needing to decrease your class size to meet the requirements in the application. But you'll notice that they are still going to be expanding the number of classrooms that they are using in district, and I'll talk more about that when we look at Table 2. But the more important thing is that this district, in this example, is working with private providers to expand the number of children who are being served. So you'll want to make sure that you include information here for any private providers you're planning to work with. However, you only need to include information about the children who you are funding in private provider and Head Start programs. So for example, if you're working with a private provider that has 10 classrooms, but you're only contracting with them for 2 of those classrooms, the information you fill out on Table 1 only needs to reflect those 2 classrooms that you're contracting with. So you don't need to show the entire universe of what's going on in that private provider. You'll also notice that in this scenario, I'm showing that they're moving from having some self-contained children to having only special needs children who are included in general education classrooms. You can have children in self-contained classrooms moving forward. The department is looking for districts to be moving more towards inclusion. So for demonstration purposes, that's what I modeled out here. So that's essentially everything that needs to be filled out on Table 1. But this table is very much linked to Table 2. Before I move on to Table 2, Beth, is there anything else that we should be focusing on here?
No, nothing.
Okay. So, so moving on to Table 2, the information in Table 2 is actually the same as the information in Table 1. It's just presented on a classroom by classroom basis. So you're going to want to fill out one line for every classroom that you're planning to open in the 1920 school year. And you're going to want to show the information reflecting what you're doing in the 1819 school year, as well as what you're planning to do in the 1920 school year. So you'll see here that in this example, the district had 9 classrooms of 18 children, and now is moving to 10 classrooms of 15 children to meet that maximum of 15 children in a classroom requirement that the department imposes. One very important thing to remember is that this 15 child maximum includes both your general education children and any children with disabilities who are being included in the general education classroom. So it's a maximum of 15 Gen Ed plus inclusion in these classrooms. Again, I'm modeling here that they're moving from having self-contained classrooms to not having self-contained classrooms. So if there are classrooms that are open in 1819 that are not going to be open in 1920, you don't need to fill out any information in that portion of the workbook. You do, however, need to fill out information based on any private providers or Head Start agencies that you're planning to work with. So in this case, we're showing the 15 children per class in each of the 3 classrooms that this district might be contracting with moving forward. One thing to note, and this will be a theme that I talk about in a bunch of the different workbooks, you may be opening classrooms and not have teachers hired yet for those classrooms. In that case, in the place of the classroom, in the classroom column where you're being asked to either name the classroom or name the teacher, simply type in "to be hired," and that will signal to the department that you know that you're opening that classroom, but you haven't hired that teacher yet. And that may happen in your private provider settings as well, and perfectly acceptable to not know yet who those teachers might be. One thing to keep in mind, you'll notice down at the bottom these two little notes that say that the current and the projected enrollment correctly matches what's on Table 1. So the information you enter on Table 1 is directly linked to the information that you enter on Table 2. And there are formulas here that are going to check those numbers against each other. Right now they match, but you'll notice if I add another 15 children in here, immediately this error message pops up that says my enrollment no longer matches and I need to go and correct that. So you want to pay attention to that. That's something that the reviewers will look at because they'll want to make sure that you're being consistent and clear to them about what it is that you're trying to do, what you're doing now, and what you're trying to do moving forward. So definitely pay attention to those error messages and don't give the reviewers any opportunity to take points away because you're not being clear about what it is that you're trying to do. So that's everything for Table 2. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Table 3. It's very self-explanatory. Any Head Start agencies or private providers that you're planning to contract with in the 1920 school year, you'll want to list them out here, one per line, and make sure that you provide some contact information for them. It's very straightforward. Table 4 is where you are going to show the department the teaching staff that you're planning to use in preschool classrooms and show them that those teachers are qualified and meet all of the requirements under the grant to be preschool teachers in the state-funded preschool program. So what you'll want to do here is fill out one line for every classroom that you're planning to open in the 1920 school year. So you'll notice that this really mimics what we filled out on Table 2. And again, if you don't know one of your teachers yet, or a couple of your teachers yet, or private providers don't know yet, simply type in "to be hired" in the columns that are asking for the teacher's name, and then leave the rest of the column, or leave the rest of the row blank. The department isn't looking for you to try to predict the credentials and the education level of people you haven't hired yet. But for the folks who you do have hired already, you'll need to fill in this information on their date of hire, their years of experience, their highest level of education, and their credentials and certification, and any language certifications or proficiencies that they might have. A couple of things to watch out for, particularly in this highest level of education. One of the things that that folks tend to do, an error that folks tend to make, is entering more than just the highest level of education attained. So for example, this teacher here who has a master's degree, the department isn't looking for you to fill out BA and master's degree. They just want to see the highest level of education completed. So make sure you pay attention to that part of the instructions. Slightly different here though in the certification section. Sorry, my mouse is being a little wonky. In the certification and credential section, you'll want to fill out every part that, or every certification and credential that an individual teacher has. So you may have a teacher who has both a P3 and a special education certification, and you want to make sure that you fill out both of those things. The common mistake that districts tend to make that is a little bit confusing for reviewers of the application, if you have a teacher who has a P3 certification, you don't need to fill out whether or not he or she had a CE or a CEAS prior to getting that P3 certification. If the teacher has only a CE or a CEAS, just fill that out. Don't also indicate that the teacher has a P3. If they don't have their standard yet, you'll want to just use one of the columns here for the CE or the CEAS. And that's a common mistake that gets made. I understand that during the mandatory technical assistance session the other day, the department was clear that existing teachers with the K-8 certification are, if you already have teachers hired who have the K-8 certification with 2 years of preschool experience. That's acceptable to meet the department's requirements, but districts won't be able to hire new teachers with that certification. Those teachers would need to go ahead and get the P3 certification. The nursery certification is actually not a certification that is given anymore, but you could have some teachers hired already who had that certification from years past. So again, you'll want to fill out one line for every classroom, and this is including any teachers in classrooms that you are contracting with in private provider locations. And the department, again, will be looking at this to make sure that teachers who you have on the rolls are meeting all of the requirements of the program. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through Table 4. It is incredibly similar to Table 4. It just is about your teacher assistants instead, and all the same kind of rules and trips and tips apply for Table 4A. It's just about your teacher assistants instead of your teachers.
I would say one thing about Table 4A, though, which is that you should have a corresponding number of teacher assistants to match the number of classes you have.
Yes.
Except in the case if you have enough classrooms to justify having a floater teaching assistant, you can include that. You would include everybody on here, and if DOE is wondering why you have more assistants than you do classrooms, then they'll come back to you for that question. And keep in mind, too, you may have more teaching assistants to support children with special needs. They would not be paid for out of these funds.
That's right. Okay. So moving on to Schedule A. Schedule A is where you will show the department's salary and benefits for all of the staff who you will have working in preschool classrooms. So you may have teachers, you may have preschool staff who are funded with your preschool education aid. You may also have some staff who are funded with other funding streams. Special education funding would probably be the most common, but you could also be using tuition funding, general funds, Title I funds, or any number of other funding streams. So you'll want to show the department what different funding streams you're using, or at least how these different staff members are being funded. Just like in the other forms, you're going to use one line per staff member. Be sure to enter in the name and the role that each person is filling. Again, if you don't know, if you haven't hired for a position yet, simply type in to be hired. That's completely fine. You will need to fill out a projected enrollment, a projected salary and benefit amount for anyone who is to be hired. And actually, I'll delete this out here. If it's someone who you're planning to hire next year or who has not been on the books for you in 18-19, you don't need to put in any salary or benefit information for 18-19 because obviously you didn't have that person on the books yet. You do need to provide 18-19 salary and benefit information for anyone who is currently on staff, who you're planning to still have on staff and work in the preschool program for next year. So one line for every staff member. What the department is going to be looking for is looking at this workbook to make sure that you're filling all of the required positions and meeting all of the required ratios that you'll find in the budget guidance that the department should be putting out sometime in the next couple of days, and also in the notice of funding opportunity and in the operational plan. So like Beth mentioned, they're going to look and make sure that you have one teacher for every classroom, one teacher assistant budgeted for every classroom, and that you're meeting ratios for positions like master teachers, the nurse, the PERT team, et cetera. And all of those ratios can be found in the guidance that the department is providing. There are a few ratios that are recommended and not required. So things like custodians and secretarial staff, those you actually have, you can add those staff at ratios up to your discretion, but then you'll want to make sure that you're paying close attention to the ratios that the department has mandates on. And those are some of the ones that I just mentioned: the teachers, the assistants, the master teachers, the PERT, the nurses, et cetera. And all of those are listed out in the guidance. It's good to know going into Schedule A that anything you record on Schedule A should also be reflected on the budget statement. So this is something that you're going to use to roll up information. You're going to, for example, add up all of your teacher salaries and then enter that information on the budget statement. So something to keep in mind when you're filling that out. Unlike some of the forms that we've looked at prior to this, it is not necessary for you to include the staff from your self-contained preschool disabled classrooms, and it is not necessary for you to include staff from any contracted Head Start or private provider locations. One thing to note, there are some districts that have been moving towards contracting out for teacher assistants. If you're doing that, you still want to have a line for each teacher assistant, or at the very least, maybe one line that indicates a number of teacher assistants who are being contracted. In place of employee name, you could write something like, contracted out, or the name of the company that you're contracting with. But you'll want to include that information on Schedule A, even though it's a contract and not an employee. You'll still want to include it here just to signal to them that you know that you need to meet this requirement and that you are going to be budgeting for it appropriately. Okay.
I did have.
Oh, so
a couple of things here too to keep in mind. It's also permissible to split positions across funding streams, so that you may have, in this case, you have an early childhood supervisor who may be 0.5 under the PEA funds and at 0.5 under other funds, so that you can prorate positions, and you would have prorate positions like administrative positions like principals based on a share of the number of classes they have in the district. And the same would be true of support staff, custodial staff, and administrative staff. Unless you're in you have a critical number of classes in a standalone building that's just an early childhood building, these salaries would, and nurse likewise, would be prorated for just what portion of the time are they spending on preschool, preschool work.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I just for a little demonstration here. So you may actually have the same person listed more than once, once under the PEA section and once under the other fund section with their FTEs, and you may, like Beth said, if your early childhood supervisor is also the principal, it could actually be that that this percentage is is less. The amount that they are dedicated to just preschool classrooms could be something less than 1.0 FTE.
Yeah, and likewise, it may be true for the size of the district that you do not have a full-time master teacher, or that you have one person sharing the role of master teacher and preschool intervention staff person, so that the same person's name would be listed twice, or once with both positions under the job title, master teacher / PERT, and that could be one full-time position.
Right.
The other thing on Schedule A that I wanted to point out is that the DOE will not approve preschool expenditures for specials teachers, so that you cannot charge a gym teacher or a music teacher or an art teacher, because it's intended that all of the subject areas be integrated into the daily curriculum that you're using. Right. So that shows up sometimes in reviewing, previous years and looking at budgets. So just to give you a heads up, that's not permissible.
Right. Okay. Provider per pupil amounts. So this is going to be probably something that's a bit new to most folks. I think most of the folks who are applying for funding are not currently contracting with private providers or a Head Start agency, so this might be unfamiliar to a lot of folks on the call. What you're doing with this part of the workbook is showing the department how you're planning to allocate funding to any contracted private providers that you're planning to work with in the 1920 school year. You're going to, you don't have to do this form by classroom, it's just by agency or organization. So you'll see here there's one line for the Head Start agency, and there's one line for each of the two private providers. This section here is one that you're not likely going to use. I'll explain the difference between contracted enhanced Head Start and contracted expanded Head Start. Enhanced Head Start would be any Head Start classrooms that are a part of a Head Start agency's federal contract. So these are kids that they're already serving, and they would be using a combination of their federal funds and your state funds to serve children in an even higher quality setting than they're already in the Head Start setting. And that's going to be 99.9% of the partnerships that you'll have with a Head Start agency. This section here is much rarer, but I'll explain it just in case you come across it. Expanded Head Start sites are Head Start locations that might have additional classroom space available that you could use for them to serve children, but those children would be served outside of their existing federal Head Start contract. So, for example, maybe a Head Start agency has 10 classrooms. Right now, they're serving Head Start children in 8 classrooms, but they have these 2 other classrooms that are sitting open and available, and they'd be willing to work with you to serve children there. They would not be using federal funds to serve those children. They would only be using state funds. So they would be funded at the higher per pupil rate, the one that's used for regular contracted private providers. Again, that's fairly rare. It doesn't happen all that often. But if it does, you'll know that that's the section that you need to use on this form. So for each private provider you're planning to work with, you'll want to fill out one row. In this column for projected contracted eligible preschoolers, you want to include the general education and the inclusion children that are being served by or projected to be served at the Head Start or the private provider location. And I'll explain the significance of that on the district budget statement. But it really goes to funding appropriately all of the children that are being served in those contracted settings. In column E, in the 1920 per pupil amount column, you'll want to refer to the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the NFO. In there, there's a chart that lists out the per child amounts by setting. So by district setting, by private contracted private provider setting, and by Head Start setting. And those per pupil amounts are different based on where children are being served. So the amounts that you see in here right now are directly from the NFO, and these are the amounts for Camden County. So $8,013 is the amount for Head Start agencies in Camden County, and $14,502 is the private provider amount for providers in Camden County. So you'll want to fill that in directly based on the numbers that are in the NFO. Column F is where things get a little bit trickier, and this negative amount that you will fill in here is going to be based on 2 different things, and I'll explain them separately. The first is that built into each of the per pupil amounts listed out in the NFO, so that is the district amount, the Head Start amount, and the private provider amount, is funding for not just the cost of serving children in the classroom, but also the district-wide costs for the administration of the program. So things like the nurses, the master teacher, the early childhood supervisor, professional development, and all of those things that are part of the district's administration of the program, funding for that is baked in, if you will, to each of the 3 per child amounts that are in the NFO. So you don't want to pass the entire per child amount that the department is providing to you on to your private providers, nor do you want to use the full amount that's being provided to you for in-district classrooms and use it completely on the classroom costs. You want to take a portion of that and make sure that you're setting it aside to cover your district-wide costs. A lot of districts ask for a ballpark of what that should be. It's really difficult to give that. I've seen districts that take out $800 per child. I've seen districts take out $2,500 per child. It's really going to vary on how you set up the district-wide administration of your program, whether you're sharing services across other aspects of the district or with other districts. So unfortunately, it's really hard to give you a ballpark. And you may need to play around with your budget a little bit to figure out what it is that you need. The other aspect of this, of course, is that you'll need to help the private provider have a per child amount that is based on their actual expenditure needs for them to also meet the requirements of the program. So one major idea to keep in mind is you'll notice here that even though these two private providers here, you will be given the same per child amount for each of those providers, what you pass along to them probably should be different from each other. And that's because they're going to have unique situations based on their actual costs. So an example of why providers might be different from each other, for example, you may have a private provider who has, who's leasing their building and is contracting with you for 4 classrooms that have teachers who have been there for 15 years and all have master's degrees. And then you might contract with another private provider whose space is provided to them in kind. So they have no space costs, and they just hired 4 brand new teachers who have, 1 year of experience and bachelor's degrees. So you can see in that example where you would have private providers whose actual costs are going to be very different from each other. The only way to find that out, of course, is to have conversations with the providers that you're planning to contract with and try to help suss that out and figure out what their needs are. You're probably not going to get it perfect, and certainly not in the first year that you're contracting with them. It's a bit of an iterative process with your private providers, but you should expect to go into it understanding that their actual costs are going to be different from each other. The department will, to help you through that process, the department has a budget workbook for private providers that you should use. It's something that's available on their website. And the good news is that it's not something that you need to submit with your application. It's not actually a document that the department collects at all, but it is something that in the future auditors often look at to make sure that private provider expenditures, that they're using their funding appropriately and not expending anything on line items that they shouldn't. So that's a document that you should look for and use in your conversations with your private providers. It'll help a lot to help to suss out exactly what it is they need and where their funding should be allocated. But again, it's not a document that needs to be submitted with your application or even filled out in its entirety before you apply. Just a good tool for you to use in your conversations with the private providers. The last thing to remember on this form is these totals here. So this $270,000 number here and this just over $1 million number here. These are figures that you're going to need to transfer onto the budget statement, and I'll show you where that is. But you'll need to refer back to this workbook when you're filling out your budget statement to make sure that, that those numbers get transferred over accurately.
I just have a couple of things. I wanted to point out that over the last couple of years for expansion, districts have been required to submit a letter of intent for contracting with providers. And it's true now that you also need to submit letters of intent, and that's part of what is stated in the application. But this year is different in that this year it includes the provider per pupil amounts. You're required to fill out this table that we're looking at now. And that requires you to be talking to and negotiating with providers right now because this is due to be submitted in a couple of weeks. And that means you need to sort out some details. And even if you haven't fine-tuned it down to the dollar with the providers or a Head Start program that you work with, you want to come in with a pretty close ballpark figure for what you're expecting to pay them for the services this year.
Yeah, great point.
And I wanted to say that, as Karen pointed out, it's a little hard to figure out how do you decide how much you retain for your expenses. And I think another way to look at it is to sort of think about how often will your master teacher need to be going out, how many classes are you contracting with, how often will your administrator need to be there, and to try to be thinking about what are your costs for going out and supporting the program, and then hitting on, as Karen suggested, a per pupil amount to make it a little more scientific so that if you add a class next year and you have some idea of what you're retaining per pupil, it will be easier to factor going forward.
Absolutely. That's great. Okay. So now moving on to the big one, the budget statement. So here obviously is where you're going to show what funding you're using and how you're allocating it. So you'll see I've added some notes in here that you won't see on your versions. I just did that for our demonstration today. I'm going to walk you through these dollar amounts that appear at the top of the budget statement. So this first one here, for those of you that are EXA and LE districts, and hopefully you know who you are already, you've been getting preschool education aid from the department for the last couple of years in the form of your EXA program or your LE program. So if you are one of those districts, you're going to see a dollar amount added in here on the worksheet already. In this particular case, this $1.6 million number. That number should be familiar to you. It should match what you saw on your state aid notices and in your approval letters from the Division of Early Childhood Education that you got probably at the end of March or beginning of April. So that's what that number represents there. This 130 number is going to pull directly from Table 1. And I'll just say overall, when you look at this section of the workbook, if you look at these enrollment numbers and they don't look right to you, or they're not what you would expect to see as the totals for these different areas, go back and revisit Table 1, because maybe you may have entered numbers on lines that you didn't intend to enter enrollment numbers. So this is a good check for you, this summary here, to make sure that this is that this reflects exactly what you're intending to do in the 1920 school year. This row 13 right here, again, this is only for districts that are currently getting preschool funding from the state. This would be for any preschool education aid carryover that you're looking to use in the 1920 school year. This you'll fill in manually. This does not, obviously the department doesn't know your carryover and what you're planning to use. So if you have carryover that you want to use, you would fill this in manually. Row 14 here, everyone should see funding in this line. This is where any expansion PEA funding will show up. So if you are a district that does not currently get any state funding for general education preschoolers, the dollar amount in this cell is going to reflect your enrollment that you entered on Table 1, multiplied by the applicable per pupil amounts from the NFO based on where you're planning to serve children in district, Head Start, or private provider settings, and totaled, and that will be entered in this automatically in this cell. If you are an EXA or LE district that already gets funding from the state, the amount that will automatically appear in the cell is going to be the difference between your projected enrollment calculated based on the per child amounts that are in the NFO, less what you're already showing in this line 12 right here. So this row 12 and row 14 together would be your total funding for all of the children that you're projecting if you are a district that already gets some funding from the state. So again, 12 and 14 are going to calculate automatically for you. 13 you would add in manually if you're a district that has carryover that you want to use. Row 15 is just for districts that are planning to serve some children on a tuition basis. This is not incredibly common. There aren't all that many districts that do this, but you might be a district that's planning to work with another district to serve children, in which case you would be projecting that on Table 1 and then entering manually here any tuition funding that you're planning to collect.
And let me interrupt you for a minute. And as DOE pointed out at the meeting on Tuesday, that you should not have tuition students. Any district children are funded with the new money, so you shouldn't be collecting tuition for them. And you should not be taking tuition from anyone else, including teachers' children, unless you have done everything you can to fill spaces with age-eligible district children. And then you would only in that case be able to take anyone else from out of district or take including children of teachers.
Right.
And in that case, the district should be putting in a per pupil share comparable to the per pupil share that you're getting
right
from the state.
Yep. And speaking of that, so looking at the classified special education children, this is we're going to reflect children in inclusive settings that you've projected on Table 1, and you'll need to manually enter an amount here to reflect special education funding that you'll use to support the cost of those children. The reason that you need to do that is that preschool education aid is actually only for general education children. So in order to adequately support the cost of any special education children being served in inclusive settings or in general education classrooms, you'll need to dedicate a portion of special education funding to do that. In general, the department and the reviewers are going to look to see that the amount entered here is reflecting a per child amount that's at least somewhat comparable to the per child rate for children being served in that particular setting, whether it's district provider or Head Start. So that's something really important to keep in mind when you're filling this out. And then this last row here, there won't be any children that fill in here from Table 1. This is really more for this cell right here. This would be for you to enter any additional funding that you might be using. It's not required, but there are districts that will use Title I funding, general fund funding, et cetera. And so you would enter that amount manually here as well. And then, of course, at the bottom, this would be your total projected enrollment and your total funding that you'll be allocating towards the preschool program. You'll notice here, once you get to the actual budget itself, that these columns here correspond with the funding amounts up here. So for EXA, LE, PEA, this is you're going to want to allocate these $2 amounts in here. So any districts that already get EXA and LE funding and are projecting carryover, this column should reflect those two amounts added together. Any PEA expansion funding in this cell here should be allocated in this expansion PEA column. Any tuition funding that you're planning to collect should be allocated in this tuition column here. Your special education funding from this cell in this column here, and any other funds that you're projecting in this column here. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to the budget itself. These notes here along the side are not going to be in your version. They're just some notes that I threw in there so that you can see what I did to reconcile the dollar amounts from the examples that I put in Schedule A together with the budget statement. So the budget guidance that the department will provide is going to walk you through which expenditures need to go in which of these different rows here. And for the most part, it's fairly specific about where teachers need to go, where teacher assistants need to go. In a few cases, you have a choice where early childhood supervisors and principals could go, but they'll be looking to see particular expenditures or particular budget amounts in particular rows. So you'll want to make sure that you pay attention to that in the budget guidance. That said, the department is also aware that for all of you BAs who are listening, this is a very truncated version, obviously, of the chart of accounts that you have available to you for K-12. So you may run into a situation where there's a dollar amount where there's an expenditure and you don't see a line item that kind of immediately makes sense for you to use. In that case, I would recommend first go back to the budget guidance, just make sure that cost isn't addressed somewhere. If it is not addressed anywhere, you can certainly reach out to the department and ask for a recommendation. But from my experience, what I would recommend you do is use the line item that is the closest, sort of the next best. line item that you would use, and just make sure that you describe it in your budget narrative. As long as you have it clear in your budget narrative what's budgeted where and why and how, you should be in good shape. Again, the folks at the department know that not all of the line items are available to you here, so you may you may run into an expense that doesn't fit perfectly into a line item. Another thing I wanted to point out, you'll see that in here I have some lines that are split funded and some lines that are not. It's really up to you how you want to do that. The reviewers are really going to look more from a global perspective at your budget to make sure that all of the costs are being adequately covered, and that all the salaries that you put on Schedule A are here represented on the budget. They won't be worried so much whether it's being completely funded by preschool funding or partially funded by special ed or other funding. It's really up to you how you want to how you want to account for that based on your own district protocols.
And as a reminder, as Karen said, when we looked at Schedule A, you want to be looking that salaries and benefits match Schedule A. So if you total those benefits line across and then total the benefits line, the column on Schedule A,
yep,
they should match.
You want to,
so it should be an easy, there should be a,
and let's, yeah, so here's the test, here's the test. So, 560,000 and 540. So I must have made a change at some point along the way, but you'll want to make sure that those two match up. So shame on me for not doing that. Yeah, that's a really great point. They will be looking to make sure that those totals match across. So you want to pay attention to that. Speaking of errors, like I mentioned, these dollar amounts here up at the top are corresponding with columns down here. So the department is going to check to make sure that the totals here are matching up with your totals down here. And you'll notice that they don't in this case. If you if one of your columns is not matching up, you're going to see this word please down here. It's actually supposed to say please check total, but for whatever reason, the whole phrase doesn't come out. But you'll want to make sure that you check to make sure that none of the error messages are appearing down here, and that you've taken care of all of those, because they will likely take points off of your application if everything doesn't tie out. One tip, a recommendation I would make, to the extent possible, I would not use anything other than whole dollars in your budget. Once you add numbers in, it rounds, and you can get these little error messages down here because you have 33 cents hidden somewhere in one of these amounts that's entered, and it can be a really frustrating experience to go in and try to find where that error is. So I would recommend just using whole dollar amounts to the extent that you can as you're going through. One other tip I would say is to make sure you don't ignore or neglect line items like materials and supplies, and
nor overpad them.
Nor overpad them. Or lines like this. This is the line where you would budget for professional development expenses. Especially if you talk about things in your operational plan. So if you talk about how you're going to have lots of great professional development for your teachers in your operational plan, and then you have $0 budgeted in this row, that's something that'll send up a red flag to your reviewers, and they'll think that you don't have a viable budget. So you'll want to make sure that at the very least you have something in here and you describe in your budget narrative what it is that you're doing with that funding. Same thing with things like the classroom materials and supplies, field trips, things like that. So those are all things to think about. Again, the department really is going to look holistically at this budget to make sure that you're meeting all of the requirements. But these are just little kind of tricks that to keep in mind as you're going through. These last two lines here are not used all that frequently. Occasionally, districts that are doing some maintenance or like small minor repairs, maybe retrofitting a toilet or putting in some playground equipment, will need to put we'll need to put funds in these rows. My recommendation would be if you put anything in one of these rows, also if you put anything in a row, the row other objects, make sure you explain it in your budget narrative, because it's sort of a catch-all, and the reviewers won't know what it is that you're spending your dollars on unless you tell them in your budget narrative. So you'll want to make sure to look for that.
I would say that classroom technology costs also do go into instructional equipment, so that may be something that would show up.
Yes, absolutely. So Beth, is there anything else you want to add before we start looking at the questions in the chat box?
Well, I would only say that Karen has been referencing budget guidance. So there is a document called District Planning Budget Workbook Instructions. I believe that the department is seeking to post those to the PEA tab on the early childhood website, but that has not been approved yet or happened yet. So I would say there is a 2019-2020 budget workbook instructions that is posted to the website. I didn't double check to see where you can find that, but if you go to the Division of Early Childhood website and look at the district preschool documents,
I think I can actually find it for folks probably relatively quickly, but we could also send a link out to everyone.
As Karen points out, the workbook instructions really do a good job of spelling out where you put everything, and I would even remind people, 2 months from now, if you get approved, to go back to it and use it, because it can be very useful, although this one that you would see posted is not specific to the preschool education aid district. It is
the line items.
The line items.
They still apply, yes, absolutely. And so one other thing before we go to questions from the chat box, just to remind folks, if you don't know already, NEAR is going to be holding regional in-person technical assistance sessions coming up in the next 2 weeks. You should have received information about them, and I think we resent that information the other day, but there's a meeting in Piscataway on Tuesday, July 16th, in Clifton on Wednesday, July 17th, and in Bayville on Tuesday, July 23rd. Those are opportunities for the folks who are working on the operational plan to come and ask questions, but also folks who have questions about the budget to feel free and come to ask questions. And that's where, once you start messing around with these forms a little bit and getting to know a little bit better what it is that you're planning to do, you may have some more nuancey questions to ask that are very specific to your district, and those would be a good opportunity for you to come and ask some questions.
And the writing workshop flyer was resent to your districts yesterday. For those of you that are eligible for funding, you should have all received it yesterday. Just be sure you register with me, Beth Gardner, at NEAR, if you have not already done so.
Yes. Okay, so the first question, and Janet, thank you for being so patient. I know you asked your question a while back. We wanted to wait till the end just to make sure we got through all of the worksheets. On table 1, if you're a current ECBA district, and this would apply for LE districts as well, with preschool students and are looking to expand your enrollment and program in the 1920 projected enrollment, where do you show enrollment numbers? So you're asking, do you show enrollment numbers in row 49, or do you show enrollment numbers in row 50? What my understanding from the department is that the answer is both. So in this scenario, if you had, so let's change it up here. So if you were already planning to serve about 130 children in your district next year, and then you're planning to expand and say open 3 or 4 new classrooms, you would put those 60 children here. So you'd show them that you're using a combination of your existing preschool funding that you are already going to get and additional preschool funding.
And if you refer back to the budget statement we were just looking at the top of the page, you'll see, I think that sort of helps answer the question.
Yeah.
In the first row, we want to be sure that we're showing some children. That's where the 130 children will populate.
Yep.
And then the expansion children will populate based on district, provider, and Head Start kids that total to that one funding line 14 on page, on the budget statement page.
Right. So the next question from Monica. If a staff member will be, whoops, just lost it.
Filling 2 roles, one line or 2?
1 line or 2. Oops. So there's really no wrong way to do it. You can, so you'll see in my example here, I have fictitious Elizabeth Jones filling the role of CPIS and PERT, and I have that on 1 line. There wouldn't be anything wrong with having the same person on 2 lines. Oops, sorry, I just deleted one of them, but that's okay. You could do, you could just as easily do it like this and say that they're going to do, you know, part-time this and part-time this. So that's absolutely acceptable as well. How to estimate salaries for new staff.
Could I just looking at Schedule A, I want to also just, this made me think in terms of shared positions. I just want to be sure everyone's clear that it is not permissible to have a classroom teacher also be your master teacher. So that's one role that cannot be shared. It's not permissible to have a teacher half-time in the classroom and half-time out of the classroom.
Yeah.
These are support coaching positions, and they need to be fully dedicated, or at least partially dedicated and out of the classroom in order to be able to do that. As we said, you can share other roles as the community parent involvement specialist, which is CPIS, or the preschool intervention referral staff member, that's the PERT. Those positions can be shared. You also can't share master teacher supervisor position because the supervisor and the coach, they shouldn't be one and the same person. A supervisor can be a coach, but they can't be the person that's responsible for actually supervising the person that they're coaching. So those roles should be kept separate.
Right. And Monica, you also asked about how to estimate salaries for new staff. So for it, we would recommend that you use salary guides that you have in existence at the district. And generally, the recommendation is usually to use a lower step on the salary guide, particularly for teaching staff and assistant teachers. So you'll notice here that in this to be hired teacher, I estimated that the new hire would be step 1, and it's showing a lower salary than some of the others. But honestly, it's up to you how you want to do that. You could estimate a new hire, on step 10 if you wanted to, if it would fit within your budget. But the department is silent on that. So it really is up to you how you want to do that. And we have a question about if you have a relationship with other facilities, do you all have to use the same curriculum? It's really recommended that you do that. That's where you get good bang for your buck in terms of your professional development and other purchasing that you do. It's just great for collaboration across the sites. I don't believe there's a requirement per se that says that you have to, but it definitely makes life a bit easier when everyone's using the same.
And also your coach will be coaching on whatever curriculum they're overseeing. So unless you have a coach that's experienced in several different, it would make more sense from the coaching perspective that they will all be on the same page regarding curriculum. As Karen said, it's not mandated.
Right. On Schedule A, do you put the full-time equivalent pertaining to preschool? Yes, the full-time equivalent pertaining to preschool. So, for example, this EC supervisor who we put in here, this could be a full-time employee who is half of the time working on K-3, and the other half of the time funded. Sorry, I'm making this a somewhat complicated example, though it could certainly apply. Half-time working on the preschool program, funded with preschool funding and say general education, general funds, and then half-time on K-3. So yes, you can absolutely have that happen and just be representing the full-time equivalent that staff are spending with the preschool program on Schedule A.
And it may be, even though I was going to say, even these are mostly adding up to one full-time equivalent. You may have a 0.05. I mean, it could be anything depending on who you need to pull onto the preschool for various reasons.
Yes. So we'll keep answering questions for another couple of minutes, but for folks who have to jump off, we were recording this session, so we will post it and have it available for anyone who would like to watch it again because we know it's so riveting, or if there are other staff members who you want to have take a look at it, it will be available for them as well.
And I wanted to point out too, back to the DOE website, that Karen did mention that there's a private provider workbook that's available on the DOE website. You look for in early childhood for the provider section, and you'll find a workbook that would be helpful for you as you seek opportunities to collaborate with your community providers.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question is about if a district currently receives preschool education aid for 4-year-olds, can we apply for a second classroom and mix 3- and 4-year-olds in each room? Or would the rooms have to remain one for 4s and one for 3s? No, you absolutely can. And in fact, it's encouraged. Mixed age groupings are absolutely encouraged by the department. So no, you don't need to keep the children separate. You can absolutely mix your 3-year-olds and your 4-year-olds in your expanded classrooms. If you have half-day self-contained preschool disabilities programs, can you continue with those programs? So I believe the department talked about this a bit the other day. And where it gets tricky here is that the federal special education rules say that your preschoolers with disabilities need to be provided with the same opportunities as their general education peers. So if you are providing a full day for general education children, you need to be at least offering a full day to children in self-contained preschool disabled classrooms as well, which could depend depending on their IEP, what it says in their IEP. You likely need to revisit those to see what's best for each child. But yes, you would need to figure out a way to offer a full day program to your self-contained preschoolers with disabilities once you start offering a full day to your general education preschoolers. And then looks like the last question, how do you enter student totals for half day expanding to full day? I think I understand the question. Really, all you're going to do is you're going to represent half day up here in your actual enrollment and then not show any half day in your projected enrollment. You would just convert them to full day. And the department will compare your actual from last year to your projected for next year. And they'll understand that if you had half day and you no longer have half day, that you're in the process of converting those classrooms.
And I would say another point they made at the meeting on Tuesday is that if you are unable to convert all of your half-day classes to full day in the coming year, you need to make a plan to do so in future years. But also you can be paid, as long as you do some expansion, you can be paid for the half-day students at a half rate. But it is not permissible to add new half-day kids. So right. If you retain some portion of the same number of half-day, some portion of the kids that you have in half-day programs this year, and then move most of them or as many as you can get over to full day, they'll pick up the cost of both, and the half-day program will be at a half rate.
Yeah, absolutely. On line 49 or 50. Oh, I understand what you're asking, Monica. You would put them, that's a really good question. I would put them on line 50, because you're improving their classrooms. So yeah, if you're moving from half day to full day, I would report them on line 22 in actual enrollment, and then move them to line 50 in your projected enrollment. Yeah, that's a good question. It will be the same. It'll do the same thing on the budget. Yes, absolutely. And then we have another question about whether or not other positions can be prorated, such as nurse, custodian, administrative assistant. Yes, absolutely. They absolutely can be prorated. I think the department will be expecting that. For example, you'll have custodians in elementary schools who obviously their services are going to be used for classrooms outside of just the preschool program. So that would be an example of prorating. and certainly the same thing with secretaries, nurses, et cetera. Really, the positions that you would never prorate would be your teacher and your teacher assistant. Those obviously have to be full-time in the preschool classroom. But others, depending on your circumstances, most of the other positions could potentially be positions that you are prorating. So I don't see any other questions in the chat box. Thank you all so much for listening. We will be posting this recording online, and we'll send it out to all of you. And again, really encourage you to attend those writing workshops next week and the week after. Anyone you're able to send, there'll be some really good conversation there, not just with us, but also with other folks who are applying for funding. Those sessions usually bring out some good conversations and ideas.
And once the webinar is posted, we'll send out a follow-up email to all the districts with the link to the webinar, as well as links to the private provider workbook and the workbook instructions. I don't know how quickly our webinar will be posted. I'm relatively new to NEAR, so I don't know what this process is. But I'll say, so in the meantime, go to the DOE website and locate the workbook instructions yourself so that you can start working this out sooner rather than later.
Right.
And we hope to see you next week.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.